He sat on the edge of his narrow apartment bed, staring at the blinking cursor on a blank document, knowing that once again he would close the laptop without typing a single word. It had become a nightly ritual: open, stare, freeze, quit. For years he had told himself he would write a novel someday, that somewhere inside him lived a story powerful enough to change his life, maybe even touch someone else's. But every attempt collapsed under the weight of his own expectations. He wanted to write something brilliant, something worthy, something that would prove he wasn't just another person drifting through an unremarkable life. Instead, frustration grew into a constant, suffocating companion. He was 32, exhausted from a job that drained him, disappointed in a life that felt like a long sequence of delays and excuses. That night, the silence of his room pressed on him like a heavy blanket. The air felt stale. The same cup from yesterday still sat on the table. The same unwritten ideas hovered in the same corners of his mind, taunting him. He wondered how many years he'd wasted thinking instead of doing, dreaming instead of acting. He tried to remember the last time he felt proud of himself, but nothing came. The realization stung. He wasn't failing because he lacked talent. He was failing because he refused to start. That thought cut deeper than he expected. He had always blamed the circumstances, the fatigue, the stress, the lack of time, the absence of inspiration. But that night he saw the truth plainly. His life had become a loop not because of external obstacles, but because of internal fear. Fear of imperfection, fear of judgment, fear of discovering he wasn't good enough. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and let the truth settle. He couldn't keep living like this, always planning but never moving, always hoping but never committing. Something inside him cracked, not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, like a thin line forming across glass. A breaking point. He thought about people who changed their lives, not through grand gestures but through small, consistent actions. He had read countless stories, admired countless creators, envied countless successes. Yet he never asked himself the obvious question: what if he simply tried? What if instead of demanding perfection, he allowed himself to be a beginner? His chest tightened with a mix of anxiety and determination. He closed his eyes and imagined a version of himself who finished things, who followed through, who didn't surrender at the first sign of struggle. For a moment he felt a spark, small but real. He opened his laptop again. The cursor blinked with the same impatience as before, but now it felt like an invitation rather than a threat. He didn't know how to fix his life. He didn't know how to write a novel. He didn't know how to silence the doubts that had been shaping his decisions for years. But he knew one thing: doing nothing had brought him nothing. Something had to change. And the change had to begin tonight. But he still felt overwhelmed. Writing a whole book seemed impossible. Writing a chapter felt intimidating. Even writing a scene felt too heavy. Then, almost instinctively, a thought surfaced, simple, small, almost laughable. What if I write only one page? Just one page tonight. His mind immediately argued back. One page won't fix anything. One page won't make you a writer. One page won't change your life. And yet, another thought followed, but it's one page more than yesterday. He repeated it to himself like a mantra. One page more than yesterday. Maybe greatness wasn't built in explosions of effort, but in quiet, steady persistence. Maybe he didn't need to write a novel tonight. Maybe he simply needed to begin. He placed his fingers on the keyboard. His heart raced as if he were about to jump off a cliff. The fear didn't disappear, But something else finally outweighed it, a fragile, trembling courage. Not enough to write a masterpiece, but enough to write a page. And on that night, for the first time in years, he pressed a key. Then another. A sentence formed, clumsy but honest. He didn't stop. When he reached the bottom of the page, he sat back and stared at what he had done. A single page. Small. Imperfect. But real. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt hope. The next morning he woke earlier than usual, long before his alarm, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and disbelief. The memory of last night shimmered in his mind like something fragile, something he feared might disappear if he looked at it too directly. One page. He had written one full page. Not perfect, not polished, but undeniably his. A small spark of accomplishment warmed him as he made coffee, something he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. On the way to work, he kept replaying the moment he typed the last sentence. It wasn't the content that mattered, it was the fact that he had finally acted. All day he moved differently, lighter somehow, as if one page had shaved off a layer of self-doubt he'd been carrying on his shoulders. The world didn't look new, but he did. During lunch he opened the page again on his phone, reading it quietly. It wasn't brilliant. It wasn't even particularly good. Yet he felt pride, not for the quality of the writing, but for the courage it took to start. That pride, however, brought with it a new fear. What if it had been a one-time moment of strength? What if he couldn't repeat it? What if last night was an exception and tonight he returned to the old pattern of opening, staring, freezing, quitting? The fear gnawed at him until he made a silent vow. Tonight he would write again. Not a chapter. Not a scene. Just another page. When he came home, exhaustion threatened to drag him into the familiar routine of distraction. The couch looked inviting, the TV remote even more so. He felt the old habits circling him, pulling him back into the gravity of comfort. But he had made a promise, and for once he didn't want to break it. He opened his laptop, the same laptop that had witnessed years of unfinished beginnings. The blank document was still there, with last night's page sitting at the top like a small victory flag. He scrolled to the bottom, hesitated, then began typing. The words didn't come easily. The sentences felt forced, the dialogue wooden, the descriptions awkward. But he kept going. He wasn't chasing beauty, he was chasing momentum. Twice he almost stopped. Once he deleted an entire paragraph before forcing himself to undo it. Another time he stared at the screen for a full minute, tempted to give up. But then he repeated the phrase that had carried him through last night, one page more than yesterday. And so he continued. Eventually the page filled. He wasn't exhilarated like the first night. This time the feeling was different. Not excitement, but resolve. Quiet, steady resolve. Something inside him clicked. He realized he didn't need to wait for inspiration. He didn't need to feel motivated. He didn't need to produce greatness. He only needed discipline. He sat back and looked at the 2 pages together. Individually they were messy, inconsistent, clumsy. But side by side, they represented something he hadn't experienced in a long time: progress. For years he had believed progress required passion, talent, fire. But now he saw the truth. Progress required repetition. And repetition required commitment. That night he closed his laptop with a sense of purpose that felt unfamiliar yet comforting. He wasn't just writing a book. He was writing himself into someone new. Before going to bed, he stared at the ceiling, thinking about what would happen if he actually continued. A page a day. Just one. In a month, 30 pages. In a year, 365. He imagined printing the manuscript, holding it in his hands. The thought felt surreal, impossible even. But not as impossible as it had felt 2 days ago, back when he wasn't writing at all. As he drifted to sleep, he whispered to himself a promise he intended to keep: tomorrow, another page. No matter what. It didn't matter if it was good or bad, inspired or dull. What mattered was movement. Because movement, even slow, even clumsy, was still progress. And for the first time in his adult life, he felt like a man finally taking control of his story, one imperfect page at a time. The third week arrived quietly, without applause or fanfare, without any grand realization or dramatic breakthrough. Instead, it crept in like an early morning fog, soft, subtle, almost unnoticeable, until he suddenly realized he had written 20 pages. 20 pages more than all the previous years combined. The novelty of the first days had faded. The spark of excitement had settled into something steadier but harder, routine. And routine, he discovered, was its own kind of battlefield. He woke early some mornings and felt ready to write, but other mornings felt like dragging himself through thick mud. Some evenings he returned home with a mind buzzing with ideas, while others he stared at the screen feeling hollow, tired, uncreative. But he wrote anyway. Some pages flew from his fingertips effortlessly, sentences forming like water flowing downhill. Other days were a war, each word a struggle, each line feeling wrong no matter how he shaped it. Yet every night ended the same, with a new page. His friends noticed little changes. He seemed more focused, less distracted, more confident in small, subtle ways. But he didn't talk about the pages, didn't tell anyone what he was doing. The story felt fragile, like a seedling not ready for the wind. He feared that sharing it too soon would crush it. He kept the commitment private, something sacred between him and the blank page. But the war wasn't only against laziness or doubt, it was against the person he used to be. The person who quit early. The person who dreamed loudly but acted softly. The person who lived in the shadow of unfulfilled potential. Every day he fought that old self, and every page he wrote was a victory, however small. There were moments when he felt the old fear whispering, "This isn't good enough. You're wasting your time. Who do you think you are?" The words stung, because they echoed years of insecurity. But instead of retreating, he answered with action. Another sentence, another paragraph, another page. He realized something important. You don't overcome doubt by thinking, you overcome it by doing. The doing silences the fear. The doing builds truth. By the middle of the week, he found himself rereading earlier pages, surprised by some of the passages he barely remembered writing. They weren't perfect, yet they weren't terrible either. Some lines even held a spark of something real, emotion, authenticity, maybe even talent. He felt a flicker of pride. But then came the hardest day yet. He arrived home exhausted after a long shift, mentally drained, physically sore, with zero desire to write. The page felt heavier than ever. He sat with his laptop open, fingers still, eyes unfocused. Minutes passed. Temptation clawed at him. Just skip tonight. One missed day won't matter. But deep down he knew that was a lie. One skipped day becomes two. Two becomes a week. A week becomes the old life again. So he made a decision. A simple, brutal decision. He would not go to bed until the page was written. No exceptions. No negotiations. He typed slowly, painfully, but steadily. It took nearly an hour to form a page that felt flat and uninspired. But when he finished, a realization washed over him like a quiet triumph. He had written through resistance. And writing through resistance was more powerful than writing through inspiration. Routine, he learned, wasn't about ease. Routine was a quiet war fought in silence, fueled not by excitement but by discipline. And discipline, he understood now, was a muscle, one that strengthened only through struggle. The next morning, something remarkable happened. He woke up not dreading the page, but wanting it. The previous night's battle had hardened something inside him, reshaped something fundamental. He wasn't just someone trying to write a book. He was becoming a writer. Not by talent, not by inspiration, but by consistency. By showing up. By refusing to surrender. The quiet war continued each day. Some battles won easily, others with difficulty. But he kept moving forward, page after page, building not just a story but a new version of himself. One who no longer bowed to fear. One who no longer waited for the perfect moment. One who no longer ran from effort. And in the quiet, patient rhythm of his daily pages, he felt something he had never expected: peace. The shift didn't happen in a single moment, but rather revealed itself slowly, like dawn spreading across the horizon. He didn't notice it at first. The change was quiet, subtle, almost shy. It appeared in small details. The ease with which he opened the laptop now, the way ideas began forming earlier in the day, the surprising calm that settled over him when he started typing. Writing no longer felt like a task he had to wrestle himself into. It began to feel like a place he returned to, a space where he could breathe differently, think differently, exist differently. And somewhere between page 30 and page 40, the story he was writing, once a vague cloud of disconnected ideas, started taking shape. Characters who had been blurry silhouettes gained voices. Scenes he hadn't planned unfolded with unexpected clarity. The story moved with a momentum he hadn't known he was capable of creating. It felt almost magical, as if he were discovering rather than inventing. He realized something profound. Consistency had unlocked creativity. Discipline had awakened inspiration. It wasn't the lightning strike of genius he had spent his life waiting for. It was the steady friction of daily effort that lit the fire. One evening, after a long writing session, he sat back and reread a few recent pages. For the first time, he felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't fully name but understood deeply. He wasn't embarrassed by the words anymore. In fact, he liked them. Not all of them, of course. Some were clumsy, some bland, some overly dramatic, but scattered throughout were sentences that felt alive. Sentences that made him pause. Sentences that made him think, "I wrote that." A subtle pride grew in him, not boastful or loud, but warm and steady. It fueled him. It softened the fear that had once ruled him. The turning tide didn't just show itself in the writing, it showed itself in his life. He walked differently, spoke differently, even carried himself differently. People at work noticed a spark in him, a grounded confidence that hadn't been there before. He found himself less irritated by small things, less overwhelmed, less scattered. Writing had become an anchor, a daily act of self-respect. But with the tide of progress came new challenges. The more invested he became, the more he feared losing what he had built. Some nights the pressure felt heavier than before. The story mattered now, and that made the mistakes feel sharper. Doubt returned in waves, suggesting he wasn't good enough to finish, let alone publish. Yet instead of drowning him, the doubt pushed him deeper into discipline. He wrote through it, like a swimmer pushing through rough water. One night, after finishing a particularly emotional scene, he closed his laptop and felt something unfamiliar, a sense of inevitability. He would finish this book. Not because he believed it would be great, not because anyone was waiting for it, but because he had become the kind of person who finishes things. That realization struck him with both surprise and gratitude. He had always admired people who followed through, imagining they possessed something he lacked. But now he understood the truth. They didn't have something he didn't. They simply acted long before they felt ready. Around page 50, the story reached a point he hadn't planned. A plot twist emerged naturally, unforced, almost as if the characters had whispered the idea to him. He sat back, stunned by the realization that he had just experienced what writers often describe but he never believed, a moment when the story guides the storyteller. He smiled. A real, genuine smile. The tide had turned. He was no longer dragging himself toward the page. The page was pulling him forward. Writing wasn't a battle now. It was a conversation. A collaboration. A journey he didn't want to end. And though the old fears still lingered in the corners of his mind, they no longer controlled him. He was moving with purpose, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered the truth. Discipline creates the doorway, consistency keeps it open, and passion walks through it. And he was already far inside. He didn't notice the moment the victory arrived, not because it was small, but because it came disguised as ordinary life. There was no triumphant music, no cinematic turning point, no dramatic breakthrough. Instead, it appeared quietly, hidden within the simple rhythm of another evening spent typing, another page added to the growing stack. What began as a personal challenge had transformed into a ritual, a daily return to himself. Somewhere along the way, writing had stopped being a task and had become a part of who he was. Not an ambition, not a wish, not a dream he kept on a shelf, an identity. One night, while rereading a scene he felt particularly proud of, he realized something astonishing. He no longer questioned whether he was a writer. He no longer doubted whether he had the right to claim the title. He had written over 100 pages. 100 imperfect, unwaveringly persistent pages. The realization was so surprising he had to stand up and walk around the room just to process it. The man who once feared a blank page now approached it with curiosity. The man who once silenced himself with doubt now answered that doubt with action. The man who once lived in the shadow of unfinished beginnings now carried the weight of undeniable progress. But the true victory, the unseen victory, wasn't the page count. It wasn't the emerging story or the characters he had brought to life. It wasn't even the fact that he was inching closer to finishing the novel he had once believed impossible. The victory was internal, quiet, permanent. He had broken the version of himself that gave up too quickly. He had rewritten the story he lived inside. He no longer waited for motivation. He no longer hid behind perfectionism. He no longer surrendered to fear. He had proven, day after day, that small, consistent actions could rebuild a life from the inside out. The book was still unfinished, but he no longer feared that. He knew he would complete it. Not because every page would be good, but because he had become someone who finishes what he starts. A few days later, he printed the first 100 pages, just to feel them in his hands. The stack was uneven, the text riddled with errors, but when he lifted it, he felt a weight that went deeper than paper. It was the weight of discipline, of effort, of a promise kept. He placed the stack on his desk and stood there staring at it, realizing the moment for what it was. Tangible proof that change wasn't a sudden transformation but a slow, steady accumulation of small choices. He thought back to the night it all began, the blinking cursor, the suffocating doubt, the quiet breaking point. He could still feel that moment inside him, but now it felt like a different lifetime. He realized he didn't just write a page a day. He rewrote himself a page a day. Toward the end of the month, he found himself sitting at his laptop, fingertips hovering above the keys, when a thought crossed his mind that filled him with warmth. Even if no one ever read his book, even if it never reached a publisher or an audience, the journey had already changed him. The old measure of success, recognition, praise, accomplishment, no longer defined him. What mattered now was the effort itself, the integrity of showing up, the quiet triumph of keeping a promise to himself. That was the real victory, the one no one else might ever notice. And as he typed the final sentence of the night, he didn't feel the pressure he used to feel or the fear that once paralyzed him. Instead, he felt gratitude, deep, steady gratitude, for the struggle, for the discipline, for the journey that had transformed him in ways he couldn't have imagined. He closed the laptop, sat back, and allowed the moment to settle over him. The book was still in progress, but the story of who he was becoming felt complete. Not finished, just undeniably underway. He had won the quiet war. He had lived through the turning tide. And now, in the gentle victory of a life rebuilt one page at a time, he finally understood a truth he had chased his entire life. Greatness isn't born in a moment. It's built in the daily, unseen victories no one else applauds, but you feel in your soul every time you show up. And he would show up again tomorrow. One more page. Just like always.